Hello and welcome to Indus News Live with me, Osman Lone. Well, we begin this bulletin with our top story, and that's from India, where 11 people have been killed in Uttar Pradesh in violent protests against a controversial Citizenship Act. This brings the death toll to 20 in over a week of unrest sparked by the law that grants nationality only to non-Muslim immigrants. The Indian government has shut down the internet in Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur, Meerut and 18 other cities of UP. In Delhi, police arrested 40 people, including 8 minors, from a massive protest outside Jama Masjid. Meanwhile, after West Bengal, the Indian states of Kerala and Bihar have opposed the new law and it on hold. The states have cited apprehension among the general public about its consequences. India has put curbs on the media reporting from covering protests against the citizenship law. In a notice, the government has issued an advisory for channels to follow while covering demonstrations. The Information Ministry has ordered media outlets to stop all content which will hurt the country's integrity. The notice said channels must not show anti-national content instigating violence. It also said channels must not air videos and content which will negatively affect the country's morale. Well, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan says India is becoming a Hindu supremacist state under the Narendra Modi government. In a series of tweets, Mr. Khan said protests against the citizenship law are becoming a mass movement. He said Indian-occupied Kashmir is still under siege and bloodshed is expected in the region when the curbs are eventually lifted. Khan warned India may resort to a false flag operation to divert the world's attention from its domestic chaos. The Prime Minister said in case of any operation, Pakistan will give a befitting response to India. Earlier, Indian Army Chief Bipin Rawat warned the situation at the line of control could escalate at any time. US presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has taken on India for cancelling a meeting with lawmakers over the Kashmir conflict. Earlier, Indian Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar refused to meet them over the inclusion of Pramila Jayapal. Sanders said he supports Senator Jayapal for being outspoken about the unacceptable crackdown on Kashmiris and Muslims. US Senator Kamala Harris has also criticized India, saying it's wrong for any foreign government to dictate what members are allowed in meetings. The occupied valley has been under a curfew and communications blackout for the last 139 days. Now, the Taliban have said intra-Afghan talks will only start after a troop withdrawal agreement is signed with the United States. Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen said each Afghan party will take part in the intra-Afghan discussions. He said this has always been the fighters' position and has been passed on to the press several times. Last week, US Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad visited Kabul and shared details of the Doha peace process with the Afghan leadership. Talks between the Taliban and the US are currently on hold after the 11th December attack on the Bagram airbase. Syria says rockets have been fired at an oil refinery in Homs. The Petrol Ministry said the systematic and synchronized attacks disrupted oil production and damaged manufacturing units. The state media reports the fires were put out after several hours and repair work has begun. Homs Governor Talal Barazi called it a terrorist attack on Syria's economy. Homs oil refinery is one of the 2 main plants meeting the country's demand for diesel and gasoline. Russia and China have vetoed a UN Security Council resolution extending cross-border humanitarian aid to 4 million Syrians for a year. This is the second time in 4 months Russia has barred Syrian aid resolution. The motion was drafted by Belgium, Kuwait and Germany. It would have allowed cross-border humanitarian deliveries for 12 months from 2 points in Turkey and 1 in Iraq. US Ambassador Kelly Craft slammed the move, saying the consequences for this will be disastrous. She said Moscow and Beijing's opposition to aid delivery is reckless, irresponsible and cruel. Well, Russia and the European Union have rejected US sanctions on Moscow's natural gas pipeline to Germany. Earlier, US President Donald Trump approved curbs on companies involved in building the $11 billion underground energy project. The EU says the bloc opposes the sanctions against its companies conducting legitimate business. The European Commission is now analysing the impact of the US sanctions. Meanwhile, the Swiss-Dutch company Allseas said it has suspended work on the pipeline to avoid US penalties. The sanctions came days after the EU brokered a deal between Russia and Ukraine on the transit of gas to Europe. Russia says it no longer wishes to rejoin the Group of Seven because it has other priorities. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said the nature of the G7's activities raises many questions. Speaking at a seminar, Ryabkov said Moscow is not interested in any preconditions for returning to the group. He said the G20, BRICS and formats for Eurasian integration are addressing more important issues. Earlier in August, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Washington will work to reinstate Russia into the intergovernmental body. Russia's membership was suspended after it annexed Crimea in 2014. In Libya, clashes have escalated with warplanes bombing targets in Tripoli, Misrata and Sirte. Earlier, the UN-backed government called on the US, Turkey and several European countries to defend its territory. Forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar battled militias fighting under the banner of the Tripoli-based government, south and east of the capital. Haftar gave the militias defending Tripoli and the coastal city of Sirte a 3-day deadline to pull out. Meanwhile, Germany has called for a ceasefire in Libya during the ongoing clashes. The UN also expressed concern about the situation in the country, with at least 284 civilian deaths this year. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break. Hello again, it's good to have you back. Now, Cyprus says it's in touch with 4 neighbouring countries to devise a strategy to counter the Turkey-Libya maritime border deal. President Nikos Anastasiades said the joint action plan with Egypt, Israel, Greece and Lebanon doesn't include a military option. He said the diplomatic effort is aimed at negating the objectives of the deal between Ankara and Tripoli. The president said the pact has also been condemned by Arab nations and the EU. Turkey says its deal with Libya's UN-backed government gives it economic rights to a large swathe of the eastern Mediterranean. But Greece and Cyprus say the deal unlawfully cuts their own economic zones. The US has opposed the International Criminal Court's investigation into alleged Israeli war crimes in Palestine. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Washington opposes any actions unfairly targeting Israel. Pompeo said Washington doesn't believe Palestine qualifies as a sovereign state. It said it shouldn't be able to participate as a state in international organizations, including the ICC. Earlier, the court's chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, said a preliminary examination produced enough for an investigation.
As there has been a referral from the State of Palestine, there is no requirement to seek pretrial chambers authorization before proceeding to open an investigation.
Well, in Lebanon, hundreds of people have taken to the streets of Beirut in overnight protests against the nomination of Hassan Diab as Prime Minister. Dozens of people were injured when security forces fired tear gas to disperse anti-government demonstrators. Earlier on Thursday, President Michel Aoun asked the Hezbollah-backed Diab to form a new government after parliamentary consultations. Demonstrators say Diab is part of the same political system against which they've been rallying. Protesters clashed with security forces when they tried to open blocked roads to traffic in the Corniche al-Mazra area of Beirut. Lebanon has faced weeks of anti-government protests fueled by anger at corruption among politicians. The demonstrators say they want the entire ruling class out of politics. Japan has briefed Iran on Tokyo's plan to send a naval force to the Middle East to protect its vessels from rising regional tensions. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani discussed Tokyo's intention to contribute to navigational safety. Abe told Rouhani Tokyo is concerned by tensions running high in the Middle East. Rouhani appreciated Japan's efforts to make its initiative transparent. The planned Japanese operation is set to cover high seas in the Gulf of Oman, the Northern Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign ministry said Rouhani slammed Washington's sanctions against Tehran, but indicates he wants to improve ties with Japan. President Xi Jinping has accused the United States of interfering in China's internal affairs. Speaking to US President Donald Trump, President Xi said he is deeply concerned over Washington's statements on Taiwan and Hong Kong. Chinese media reported that President Xi is saying states need to look for a political settlement for North Korea. His statement contradicts Trump's tweet, which said progress has been made on issues from the trade deal to North Korea. The two leaders spoke a week after their envoys sealed a Phase 1 agreement aimed at ending an 18-month trade war. The US says it still has hopes to reopen nuclear negotiations with North Korea, but is also prepared to fight and win. Tension has been rising in recent weeks, with Pyongyang carrying out a series of weapons tests and waging a war of words with Washington. US Defense Secretary Mark Esper said he hopes diplomacy with Pyongyang can be continued. He added a political solution is the best way to denuclearize the peninsula and address North Korea's issues.
I have two functions here, as I've said before. One is to ensure that we are in a high state of readiness, prepared to fight and win tonight if need be, and I'm confident in that. And secondly, to enable our diplomats. So I remain hopeful that we could, again, get the process started again and remain on the diplomatic path.
The US has accused Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of bribing lawmakers to block the re-election of rival Juan Guaido. Venezuela's National Assembly is due to vote on the 5th of January. US Special Representative for Venezuela Elliot Abrams said Maduro is using threats, arrests and bribes to rig the election. Abrams said Maduro's regime is attempting to take control of the National Assembly by preventing free elections in 2020. Earlier on Friday, Venezuela's police detained lawmaker Gilbo Caro, who belongs to the opposition Popular Will Party. The US and dozens of other countries recognize Guaido as the legitimate president, but Nicolas Maduro is supported by the Venezuelan military. Well, a scorching heat wave has intensified the bushfires ravaging Australia. Temperatures are expected to peak at 47 degrees Celsius in New South Wales and West Sydney. Fire department officials said an expected wind change would aggravate the already catastrophic conditions. Officials say only rain can help them control the onslaught of bushfires. Sydney is shrouded in toxic smoke as blazes flare just 130 kilometers from the country's largest city. You can see on your screens now, ladies and gentlemen, helicopters trying to tackle the blaze and the thick fumes of smoke coming into the city. Fires have burned over 7 million hectares of land, killing 10 people and destroying over 800 homes. 5 people have been killed by storms Fabian and Elsa, which are sweeping across Spain, Portugal and southern France. They've damaged buildings and cut power lines, while flooding and fallen trees have blocked roads. Storm Elsa hit the Iberian Peninsula on Wednesday, intensifying through Thursday and Friday. Officials said winds are likely to hit 140 kilometers per hour and generate 9-meter-high waves in the north. They said 2 men had already died in northern Portugal, while Spain's government reported 3 dead. Nearly 140,000 people were without power in southern France. Well, in Newfoundland, Canada, businessmen are cashing in on icebergs as more and more ice giants from Greenland drift to the island. Some see it as a boon and others as a stark illustration of the accelerated melting of the Arctic. More about the melting ice in this report.
Every summer in Newfoundland, Edward Keane goes hunting. for icebergs. Keane and his crew collect ice blocks that have floated down thousands of miles from Greenland's glaciers, a sight that's becoming more common as temperatures rise.
They're going to die in a couple, 3 weeks, and naturally be gone back to nature anyway. So we're not here hurting the environment.
But this is no scientific mission. There's profit to be had. The water from the glaciers of the Arctic is renowned for its purity because it was frozen long before the air pollution of the Industrial Revolution. Over 2 months, Keane and his crew can recover about 800,000 litres of iceberg water, which they sell to traders at $1 a litre. Villagers along the ice path see it as a welcome financial windfall. While some are enjoying the consequences of climate change, others are concerned.
It's a concrete image of global warming to see icebergs coming to places where the waters are so warm. It's true that it makes you wonder.
And the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. But for these coastal communities, the icebergs that venture down from Greenland could be floating white nights.
Now, once reserved for fearless adventurers, Antarctica is now just a click away for an increasing number of curious tourists. But the growing trend is increasing the threat of climate change in a continent already suffering the effects of global warming. More in this report.
130 tourists aboard, mostly from the UK, Germany and the United States, have just seen their first iceberg and caught a glimpse of Antarctica's contours. Before each stop on Antarctica, a dedicated team prepares the terrain. Comfort is a priority, but here the passengers are explorers, not clients. Before going ashore, passengers must clean their boots and vacuum their clothes. Taking food and getting too close to the animals is also forbidden. These rules aim to limit man's impact on the region's already fragile ecosystem.
We understand even more when we come here, when we see the reality, when we feel it, how important it is that it stays that way.
With 14 million square kilometres of ice, Antarctica holds 90% of the world's freshwater reserves, but remains prey to global warming. Despite intentions being perceived as good, cruise ship companies and their clients have created a paradox. On average, each tourist produces 5 tons of CO2 emissions on their way to the South Pole.
We do it because we want to see it, and we do it as responsibly as we can. But it's not going to stop us.
For the 2019-2020 season, 78,000 passengers are expected to come to Antarctica.
In Brazil, a conflict is brewing between indigenous peoples and settlers hoping to make a new living off the land. The government wants to expand agriculture and mining, but the forest is in the way. More in this report.
A trail of chopped down trees cuts through the protected indigenous land. This site is familiar by now to Tachi, a chief of the Arara people in the northern Brazilian Amazon.
It's sad when you see the trees lying on the ground like that. That piece of wood is already dead.
Criminals strike easily from the nearby Trans-Amazonian highway. But after President Jair Bolsonaro's election in October, the logging only picked up. Frustrated and defiant, Tachi and his warriors resort to extreme measures. Bit by bit, they eat the forest smaller, sometimes killing those who stand in their way. Leaders from the Arara and other tribes hit out at the invasions in a recent meeting with a senior cabinet minister.
I am a chief. I will die if you kill my land, but I will fight for my people.
Invaders feel emboldened by the new far-right president's talk, the leaders said. Bolsonaro spurns indigenous people's culture and a right to land they won after centuries of oppression. But his emissary, General Carlos Santos Cruz, said the government is not encouraging crime.
That is absurd. The invasion of any land, the occupation of any area, indigenous or not, or private, is criminal.
Deforestation levels reached a decade high in Brazil last year. But the forest protection is a life and death struggle, especially for activists. Brazil has one of the world's highest rates of murder in land conflicts.
Well, it's 15 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but don't forget, for the latest updates on all of our stories, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.